Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of NHRD Kolkata Chapter's HR Speak. As we have our chapter coordinator um, allowing the access to our listeners for the evening, we'll just give it a couple of minutes before we start today's interesting masterclass, which is the starting of a new era in HR Speak for NHRD Kolkata chapter. So far, it was more like a rendezvous which we would have with our esteemed and prestigious guests and keynote speakers. Today, we are going to start with the masterclass act of NHRD Kolkata's HR Speak. So, well, my name is Sweata Gupta, as you already know. I'm a part of the NHRD Kolkata Chapter Committee, and as a part of that, I contribute as the host and moderator for HR Speaks. My present role is with Ageas Federal Life Insurance as their organization development and inclusion head. Without further delay or ado, let me right away introduce our speaker today, Mr. Suvro Raychaudhuri. Suvro works as Director Human Resources for the Asia Pacific Solutions Delivery Center in CGI. He's from the class of 1999 Mechanical Engineering, Bengal Engineering College IIEST, and from class of 2003 Personal Management and Industrial Relations XLRI Jamshedpur. He specializes in organization behavior, information technology and systems, and HR strategy consulting, and has worked across multiple industries, including manufacturing, information technology, and healthcare in India and abroad. He is associated with human capital studies and practice. He's also pro bono learning and development facilitator for multiple NGOs, has been actively associated with multiple international and national HR forums, and is a freelance writer on articles related to resilience, habits, and practice and capability building. He's devoted musician and a cross-trained fitness. He's married to Suki, his wife. That's a beautiful name. And also his friend and anchor, and mother of their two children, Asmi and Soham. I request Shubro to give us further introduction and whatever he would want to tell us, which is not there on social media, to start with, and then definitely we'll get into the topic of the day.
Thank you very much, Shweta. Whatever is there not on social media, and I doubt there is anything that is not there on social media today, but whatever is not there on social media, there's only one way to get it, to do a survey, and I think I'll have to ask you to do a survey with my wife or my team members or my children or my parents to know that unique part of me that is not on social media, but the rest of us are all on social media anyway. But thank you. Thank you, NHRDN Chapter Kolkata, for inviting me to this session. A small disclaimer that I don't stand extraordinarily apart to be doing a master class per se, fundamentally because each one of us kind of have, crafted our journeys and we have our own unique, outstanding characteristics and identity that sets up the unique master in us in whatever we do. And that I understand is the essence of what the world tells me as diversity. So we are all diverse masters in whatever we do. But thank you nonetheless for elevating my position and and empowering me to do this masterclass.
Thank you for your humbleness, and we are really, as a community, looking forward to learn from you. Also, because today's interesting topic is around compensation, and when we were discussing being from the OD space and inclusion space, it definitely intrigues me to learn from the angle of what compensation is, how does it play out in our role, what is the industry knowledge of the same, how does it play out as an employee or as a HR professional or a payroll expert. So all of that will now unfold into the discussion that we will have. But just before that, a little warm up and understanding of what has been your journey and your story. For the number of years you have worked in different sectors, in different countries, as you were telling me, within the country as well. How has your experience been? Because we would really want to listen in from the angle of where we are presently in our life and space, and where do we desire to be, and how do we learn from your journey so far and take away the best practices.
No, I think, Shweta, I think most importantly, without going into the cliche statement of the fact that our journeys are what our learnings make us. And obviously, we need to continuously learn and relearn and unlearn. But that part aside, I think every session has large elements into it. I think from a journey perspective, uh, I think it's been a fairly ordinary journey, made extraordinary through efforts, and I think that is the only thing that matters in terms of the efforts that we put in. I keep telling my children, and they are at the life stage where they are going into these competitive exams, etc., trying to get into the talent industry, which India so proudly boasts of in the world, and I keep telling them that I think if life's question paper has 100 marks in it, a part of it comes through what we are born with, right? The nature and the nurture part of it and stuff like that. And the other 50% is what we put into it, right? And that is what the journey has been made up of. Some of us are privileged to have 150% very stronger people with lesser backgrounds but doing astounding efforts and innovation, etc., regardless of which background they come from. And the other part of it is that people come up from extremely good backgrounds with a pedigree, etc., and they have to live that trail, as I call it, as in LIVE, live that trail, which they are already standing on. So, but either way, I think continuous learning, that is number one. But what I've seen over the last 23 years of my limited journey in HR is that the talent pyramid has inverted. There was a time that we would stand up when the manager kind of walks in. There was reverence and stuff like that. A senior profile person coming in. I still think it happens in the civil services and the military part of the ecosystem, but not in the talent sector that we work in, because the talent is inverted. Now, a person who's coming in with emerging technology trend on AI and full stack Java, etc., can stand up in the middle of the crowd and say that, Mr. or Miss Manager, your 20 years, 25 years of experience doesn't do me any good if you're not being able to troubleshoot the problem for me. And that is becoming a significant challenge for us. Well, it's a challenge from a positive as well as not so positive standpoint. But I think the world has moved on talent, and particularly in the industry that we are in, the knowledge-based industry, the pyramid has all the more sharpened and inverted, and that is one very important aspect in terms of how do we keep our scalability and skillability high, and our mental awareness and our mind share on continuous learning and humility, because the world is that of wicked learning. Whoever is able to do wicked learning faster, better, is the one that is on the inverted side of the pyramid. That's an interesting change, I'd say.
Thank you so much for that, Suvro. And what I heard, if I had to just summarize that in one word, and what echoes with me is, how relevant are we? and whatever work that we are doing, how is that contextual to the board or to the group or to the team or to the management that we are working with, and how are we contributing in a way of relevance and contextualization to the overall agenda and objective of an organization or even to our families. And with that, we move on to the next segment. And thank you so much for giving us these profound knowledge of information which probably is there, but we need such sessions to bring it up to the surface, because most of the times we live with these knowledge and information and cultural upbringing that we are into, but it just gets lost in the BAU. And suddenly when there are ecosystems like this giving us the information back that, these are the basics that you live with and this is what you take forward, is where we realize that if we need to nudge ourselves back on the route. So we move on to the next segment, and that is where I will request the Banjana to go ahead and open the chat box, say in another 5-7 minutes, because we will not have a separate segment on Q&A today. What we will do is we have segments to today's topic, the masterclass on compensation, and from time to time I am going to come in to ask you to put your questions, which is going to be continuous from your side in the chat box. It's just that I will ask Suvro to answer them at specific intervals of the presentation. So what I'm trying to tell here, and I will repeat, that our chat box will be open for questions relating to compensation as and when the program is flowing. Alongside that, from time to time, I will bring in the questions and we will see how the question can enhance the learning of today's masterclass. So, Dipanjana, please open up the chat box for us, and over to you, Shubhu, to take the masterclass forward.
Thank you, Sweata. Thank you, Dipanjana, in advance, and thank you for coordinating this for me. I think before we even get into the subject of conversation of compensation, a profound transcendental philosophical statement from Henry David that you can see on the screen out there. If we will be quiet and ready enough, we shall find compensation in every disappointment. So at any point in time, if we think that we are not compensated enough, it depends on what we are looking forward to as compensation. Though this specific session is about compensation and money, the way we know it in payroll and HR, but compensation is much larger. But you know what? I mean, the last time I made a kind of a statement like this in front of my trade union friend, they said, "Sir, collective bargaining sign kab karenge management." So though I believe that there is a philosophy, a compensation philosophy that we HR people refer to as our Bible and our Red Book, I think the philosophy as a subject doesn't quite play well in compensation. It's a very hard science at the end of the day. So let's move on. I think we'll go quickly, Sweata, Dipanjana, and everybody who's attending the session. We'll quickly do a little bit of an introduction that we did. We'll talk about certain myths of compensation. We'll do a little bit of, because it's a master class and I can't talk in English and get away without talking about a little bit of technicalities. And I know that when we speak about those technicalities, there are depths in it. We won't have time to cover all of that. I will be very open to take your questions, feedback, suggestions, even after the session, because I look forward to these sessions at networking sessions that stay on, rather than having a full stop and period at the end of the session the way it is meant to be for today. So let's continue with the conversation. That's important. The dialogue is important, all right? We'll talk about a little bit of the job evaluation method. We'll do a very quick check on a comparative across industries as far as compensation is concerned, and I think that's going to be a little bit of an interesting outlook. How do we read an industry report? If somebody tells me that this is where the industry is going, and we keep reports from, we keep reading reports from Times of India and etc., etc. What does it mean, right? Do people who write those reports well acquainted and well aware of what they're talking about? Are we well acquainted and well aware of what we understand in terms of what is happening. Right. And then we will quickly go into context, consistency, communication, and culture of compensation, and so on and so forth. So let me move on to the next slide. Now, one of the myths, the biggest myth, I think, and we all rumble and fumble under this myth, and you must have seen all these news reports. A couple of clips is what I have put in. There would be millions of them every day bouncing in and out of our heads. This is the average salary increment that India Incorporation is doing, and X and Y and Z. Now, this is a very simple data that I've tried to provide out here, the simplest that I could. If you look at the inflation rate mapped against the compensation increment that India has had as an industry average, and obviously compensation increments vary slightly according to industry. Sometimes telecom does well, there's a bounce of a compensation increment there. Sometimes IT services does well, which is not the case right now as we are talking, and stuff like that. Sometimes manufacturing does well. So there are industry and company specific differences, but in general, the data that you see out here, the light blue line, is about the light blue line is about the inflation rate, and the average salary increment is the orange line. Now, when you do a subtraction, a net of that, that is something that I would refer to as effective increment. What am I getting at the end of the day, adjusted against inflation? And we've drawn a trend line out here. And the trend line is the one that you see is the dotted straight line. It's a linear trend line of the effective increment. And over the last 10 years, and that 1, 2, 3, 4 that you see on the X scale is nothing but 2014 to 2024, 11 years in consideration, right? The data source is what I have cited down there. As you can see, you will see a continuous decline in worth as established by compensation. There is a declining trend line. There has been ups and downs, but if you look at the trend line, and that is the better way of seeing trends and patterns across a longitudinal period, as long as 11 years, you will actually see a decline, right? So now that's fundamentally what it is when we say that we are giving a 8 to 9% increment, etc., and we find it very difficult, particularly in multinational organizations. Those of you who work in multinational organizations who have headquarters outside, they will keep questioning every year when we do salary planning, saying, why is India doing 8 to 9%? Our salaries are 3 to 4%. Europe says my salary is around 2 to 3%. So what is India? What is the big fat India story that you will do 9 to 10% as a salary budget, right? And we keep on going back to them and explaining the myths and the realities. Now, let me move on. This is something that we need to understand. Compensation has to be inflation adjusted for any wealth creation to happen. So if there is any large philosophy that we are talking about in terms of compensation philosophy, the philosophy for the employer should be to create wealth. And it happens, unfortunately, that's not what I'm seeing as per the trend line. That happens when we take into some of these factors, inflation being the most major part, to be able to create wealth, and so on and so forth. Now, what determines compensation? Now, this is a slightly busy slide, but let me quickly dive into what are the determinants of compensation. This becomes very, very important, right? Now, see, the ongoing global situation remains worrisome. I mean, according to Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in its November 2023 report, I think the data that I read is that the global growth is expected to decrease from 3.3% in 2022 to 2.9% in 2023, further dropping to 2.7% in 2024. Now, despite the global growth shrinking, India shines as a leading global growth engine in 2023, with a remarkable GDP growth of 7.6% in the second quarter of FY24 and around 7.7% in the first age horizon, which is basically 2 quarters of F24, right? But however, due to ongoing global compression in business cycles, which is what OECD report tells us, India does get impacted. And as businesses adapt to dynamic market conditions, etc., short-term incentives emerge as a pivotal strategy because organizations are losing their power to provide one-time full compensation increment to be able to drive employee motivation and foster the performance excellence that they want to drive. So there is more focus on giving short-term incentives, bonuses, etc., the short-term one-time ones, rather than one that gets stuck into the denominator and gets carried forward, because organizations are losing the ability to kind of afford that. Right? Now, compensation, I mean, to come back before we go into the determinants of compensation, I think there's one thing very important, that it's not a birthright. We earn it, right? So this presentation will kind of hopefully help us understand the factors that determine it, which is what this slide is about. And whereas a lot of it has to do with what we do to earn it, it makes sense to consider my favorite author, Malcolm Gladwell's principle on this, to understand that there are always the play of probabilities in action. So being at the right time, at the right place, making the right choices, etc., also play a very important role in compensation at an individual tactical level. But I'm not really going into that part of it in terms of the individual tactics of an employee and so on and so forth. But yes, there are certain factors that are applicable to all of us, which we will discuss out here, right? And interestingly, as we kind of make ourselves comfortable into our Zoom screens, discussing compensation, India minimum wages is at around that average of INR, Indian rupees, 250 to 300 per day. Well, it varies by state, it varies by trade. We all know that in the HR field. But I think my average reading of it is around 250 to 300 rupees per day, which is considering a full 8 hours of extreme labor in temperatures exceeding 38 degrees at an average. So there is a bunch of people who are not cozily sitting on the Zoom screens like we are right now, and they are being compensated at INR 250 to 300 per day only. That is also compensation, by the way. But again, let's drive away from the philosophy and let's get into it. Now, it's a highly secretive area, like many other strategic elements are, right? I mean, people don't talk about strategy. Strategy has an element of surprise and an element of timing. So compensation is a very, very strategic one. We don't talk about it. Many organizations have started talking about compensation very openly, but most of compensation elements still remain to be very confidential and secretive. Organizations for the same role can have extreme outliers, considering specific value that the role holder brings in. Those are those individual ones that kind of are outliers. But there are macroscopic factors that ideally should be known to all as determinants of compensation. The nature of the organization and the size of it determines its pay structure and compensation. And how does that happen? There is something called an economic value chain, right? It is not the, what do you call it? What do the venture funds call it? I forgot the name. It is not the value that is assumed, but the actual economic value chain that arises out of its activities, out of the activities that the organization does. Okay? And any disruption to this is not a sustainable one. What this means is that, let's say there is a startup funded organization which is doing delivery of groceries. Now, delivery of groceries is a complicated supply chain problem, right? You need to have almost a just-in-time delivery, particularly concerning perishable foods, customer demands, etc. You're ordering stuff from the app. They need a warehouse closer to the center of the customer nodal point and stuff like that. So it is complicated, no doubt. But don't forget that the food delivery chain will not have the economic value chain that I'm talking about here. An economic value chain is one that consists of manufacturing, R&D, sales and distribution, procurement, etc., all built in. So organizations that are built on size and have an entire economic value chain to it has a compensation philosophy and standard that is slightly different from those who don't have it. right? And therefore, it is very important to understand where am I working for? What compensation can I expect? Is it sustainable? And so on and so forth. Now, somebody can come in and break that mold saying that, oh, no, no, no. I have two Series A, Series B funding, and therefore I can go all out and buy out anybody in the market because I am a startup. I don't have a brand associated with it. So I need to pay money to get people in and disrupt the entire system around compensation. And we have seen a lot of those examples happen in the last couple of years, but whether it's sustainable or not is what the question is, right? So fundamentally, the organization size, which is what is the nature of the organization, what is its economic value chain, what is the employee headcount, that plays a role in its affordability and the construction and the architecture of the compensation philosophy. Okay. I mean, very simply stated, a startup which is funded does not necessarily have a complete economic value chain, can afford temporarily to disrupt the compensation structure in the ecosystem. But whether it's sustainable or not is something that we need to check because the operations may not be sustainable because of the economic value chain not being there. That's what I mean to say. Second is the dimensions of the job, and we'll quickly go into the dimensions of the job in the next slide, right? It has a lot of things. For example, what is the impact that the job has in that economic value chain? What is the contribution that job has? And I'm not talking about the person right now. I'm talking about the content of the job. What is the contribution of that job in the overall economic value chain of the organization? What is the accountability? What is the communication? What is the frame? What is the innovation, complexity, and so on and so forth? A couple of them are associated with the job, a couple of them are associated with the role, and a couple of them are associated with the role holder. Now, all of these play a very, very important role in compensation. So, for example, let me give you a small example, and maybe that's going to be a little bit clear. So, for example, an HR manager of a factory would typically have a frame which is external, because in many of our HR factories, and many of you who have worked there would know, it requires an external frame to be operating with. There are union settlements that are happening, there are negotiations to do, and so on and so forth. There are pollution control board people to deal with. There are and so on and so forth, right? So the HR manager of the factory would typically tend to have a score on the frame part of it, which is higher than an HR business partner of a typical organization, which is not a manufacturing organization and does not have as much of an external interface like the HR manager of a factory has, right? Similarly, on the know-how part of it or the impact part of it, right? I mean, the person who's sitting in a company which is doing tremendous emerging technology work, which is likely not in production, but likely to have a significant impact in the next 3 to 5 years, would have a dimension of the job score on the impact part of it much higher than somebody who's in an organization which is doing a steady state job, which is the job has a steady impact, right? And so on and so forth. And then comes the classical factors in terms of the team size. A large organization with a manager having a larger span of control and international span of control with its complexity associated with that would likely tend to have a dimension of the job score on the team size higher than one who doesn't have it, and so on and so forth, right? So there are a lot of details around it, but some of the dimensions of the job that we look at it are what you see on the slide: impact, contribution, know-how, accountability, etc., etc. Then comes the market and industry trends, right? As I said, there would be certain trends that are temporary in nature because some smaller firm as a startup could come up and disrupt it because they need to do it and compensate people in the absence of a brand that they have, and they still need to have the right people on board, and therefore they can go around creating a disruption in the competition standpoint. But in general, there is always a certain benchmark that industries follow and companies within that industry follow, which is what the market and industry trends are about. So, for example, when we say that IT services organizations in India are going to do, let's say, an 8% increment in F24, it is very different from a statement saying that the IT product side of the business is going to do the same increment or not. So there are market and industry trends that again goes back to point number one, by the way, and point number two, which is what is the organization size that the organization is operating in? What is the dimension of the job? Whether the organization is having an entire economic value chain or not. And the market and the industry trends are a lot about determining benchmarks based on point one and two, at least, if not more. And then comes a lot of individual factors. For example, the unique talents or skills that the role holder has, right? The performance and the potential. It's not just about the performance, but also about the potential, which is slightly more longer term. Performance may be a 1 year's appraisal. Now I get a 1 year's appraisal, which is exceeds expectation or significantly exceeds expectation. And I run to my manager and ask for a significant increment. I think that is where a little bit of dissonance happens in terms of what I want versus what the organization needs. Because unless I'm able to establish a little bit of potential to my organization in terms of the value that I need to bring in, a year's performance is not necessarily an indicator to immediately ask for a revision in compensation and stuff like that, right? Then where am I at? Current denominator and structure of compensation. I mean, and I was talking to Sweata about a while back on some of these things. That's what is happening to the industry in terms of diversity pay gaps across women and men for the same role in the same organizations and the same job that they are doing, right? And there is a lot to do with the current denominators. What we find out is that there could be many reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that women tend to drop out of the jobs in order to meet certain social family demands. Right. It is unfortunate, but that's the practical reality of things. When they want to come back, their current denominator falls because people who have been in the industry have grown up while the woman was out of the job. And therefore, the current denominator becomes low. And therefore, her negotiability in the job market goes down because the current denominator, even if you allow a 30% increase on a particular denominator, which is what we typically do. And I don't know whether I'm the right thing to do, but because we should not. I mean, ideally, we should not bring that denominator. We should evaluate on a zero base, which is fundamentally saying that I don't want to look at your denominator. I should not be looking at the denominator because I know it has already fallen. I want to see what you bring to the table. Have you leaned in enough in terms of reskilling, upskilling yourself? If you have, then I don't care about a 30 or a 40 or a 50% on that current denominator because that itself is not in place, right? So those are certain things that also matters in compensation. And obviously the experience, education, certifications that we continuously do and continuously upkeep with, and most importantly, business growth and affordability, right? I can be an organization of a very large size. I can have a job in the set of economic value chain, which is significant, but this year I cannot afford it because my clients are not willing to increase the billing rate that I would have wanted. Why would the client not increase the billing rate? Could be a factor of multiple reasons. Right now, we are in the IT services. I don't know whether you are aware of that. We are facing a situation where many of our manufacturing clients have dropped the ball on growth, fundamentally because of high rates of interest. When interest rates grow high, they cannot invest in capex, and many of the manufacturing industries are very high capex driven. Now, if I need to borrow money in order to invest in capex, I am not being able to do that, or I would want to defer that because the interest rates are very high. Now, when my movements are not happening on capex investment, I'm not being able to grow, and therefore I will not be able to give out outsourcing jobs or increase billing rates for my outsourcing vendors. So those are certain things on business growth and affordability that are very important. At the end of the day, we must appreciate the fact that considering it's a fair play, sometimes it is not, considering it's a fair play, we have to be owners in the organization and the value chain that the organization wants to establish, to be able to kind of appreciate certain nuances and say, okay, fine, I mean, this year it hasn't been good, but let me still stick to what I'm doing, do more, and help the organization excel. And when I do that, my personal belief, and I believe in the, I'm an extreme wide theorist. I believe that things turn for the better, and that organization would recognize that and will dole out a compensation which is in line with my expectations at some point in time, if not today, because I have a business growth and affordability issue. Now, let me go to the next slide, which is about the job dimensions. And we are actually on point 2 on this slide. So, but let me do a little bit of an elaboration on that. Sweata, would you want me to stop by a little while and take questions, or shall I just pass and?
So we'll do it after the 6th slide because it's a connecting slide.
Sure, I will do that. I will do that. Fantastic. All right. So, for example, so for example, I mean, just to continue the conversation that we were having, for example, you are in one of the economic value creation sections, let's say an R&D laboratory, and your job in that organization is measured on multiple job factors that I just mentioned, right? Like impact that your role creates and the innovation that your role holds. Now, if you are just delivering according to specific standard guidelines, that's primarily called delivery, right? And you can use any terminology, but in the compensation framework that we typically use, be it a Mercer framework or a Hay-Con framework, the semantics may be different, but fundamentally what it's saying is that you are just doing a delivery where the score on the impact of your role is low. Now, if you are working with operational targets or service standards, you are operationalizing in impact, which is higher than the delivery impact, right? And therefore, the score where one is working in an operational target or service standard associated job, where your job requires you to be moving around operational targets or service standards, your score is slightly higher than the person who is just delivering from an impact standpoint. Now, if you're specifying new products, processes, standards based on, let's say, an organization strategy or set operational plans, that impact is tactical, which is higher than the operational role. So if you look at the nomenclature, and as I said, the semantics could be any different. I think it's important for us to understand the essence. What you are doing and what impact it has on the economic value chain sets your score, not your score, but the role that you're holding, that particular score role, a role score rather, from a delivery to an operational to a tactical, right? And then it goes into something called a strategic or visionary, where you could possibly be doing something completely groundbreaking to do something that adds or disrupts the economic value chain of your organization and possibly in the ecosystem around you, which is what NVIDIA did vis-a-vis Intel in the very recent times that you've come to know about, thanks to AI, right? So that is fundamentally what happens. Sometimes the role definition also changes depending on what the organization is targeting and strategizing on, right? Similarly for communication and innovation. If your role requires external communication, that is the example that I was trying to give you through that HR manager example, right? It requires negotiation of longer term nature or influencing strategies that shape the working of the firm, as against, let's say, just an understanding of the information or comprehending it or adapting and exchanging of stated facts and information. You are higher in the role if you're doing something that is more negotiating, more influencing, rather than the other example that I was talking about, right? Now, what happens is, so if you look at the job dimensions, and the job dimension 1 may be know-how, job dimension 2 may be impact, job dimension 3 may be innovation. these have sub-dimensions, right? And as I said, the sub-dimensions are, for example, operational, delivery, operational, tactical, strategic, correct? And it could be broken down into any number of subdivisions. Now, each of these sub-dimensions corresponding to a dimension has a score associated in the job evaluation framework that we do. All these scores are blended in with the organization size. Now, what does this blending in the organization size mean? A manager in a smaller organization would tend to have a lower score, unfortunately, than the manager in a larger organization, though the subdimensions of the scores may be similar. So after we do the subdimensional scores, the size of the organization also matters, because it is implicitly assumed that the size of the organization also creates a larger complexity, and therefore the person's role has to be compensated for a particular reason. So blended along with the subdimensional scores and the organization size, there is a particular score that is formed. For example, you see 189, 167, 200 on the slides out here, right? And there are descriptors therefore given. Why is this score associated? Why is this particular role associated with this particular score? The descriptors are documented. And let's say the total of the points of that role is 556 based on all the sub-dimension measures, organization sizing, etc., etc. Let's say it is 556. Now that 556, where does it fall on another table, which we have called the total point range? Now, in the table below, you see a little bit of an example where 556 is basically a number in between a range, the total point range. And that tells you that your job position of an organization of that size in the industry that the organization is operating in is a position number 56. And that position number 56 in the organizational hierarchy of similar organizations in that particular industry would typically contain, what do you say, designations like senior manager, deputy general manager, etc., etc. Now, this is where you know that a senior manager, deputy general manager would fall into which role, and therefore the pay that they deserve to get. Now, if some industry comes in and disrupts it, or some company comes in and disrupts it, they may be able to do that. But at the end of the day, we need to understand how sustainable that is. So when you're making job shifts and looking at compensation as one of the primary reasons for a job shift, please do consider the factors that are associated with organization size and that economic value chain that establishes the importance of the role, so that the compensation that you are getting is sustainable. Otherwise, it will not be. And that is where many of the layoffs are happening these days, because we don't understand some of these fundamental principles. Let me go on to the next slide. All right, but I will come back to this slide, maybe slide next to next. All right, but maybe next to let me move to the next slide, and let's talk about something which is the market and industry trends. And if you remember this slide, we are going into point 3 now. What are the market and industry trends? Now, there are market and industry trends. Well, I have put 3 tables, and let me explain this to you a little bit. And these, I mean, why specifically these 3 tables? It's because these are the 3 industries that I have worked in, and therefore if you are throwing a sharp question at me, possibly I'll be able to defend to an extent, right? Because it's a complicated subject at the end of the day. The first table is a typical P&L sheet, profit and loss sheet of a manufacturing organization. The second table is a typical P&L sheet of a typical hospital sector. And the third is a typical P&L sheet of an IT services organization. Right now, there are a lot of stuff there. I don't want to go into P&L as a subject area out here because it's slightly complicated, but I want you to kind of focus on the red lined area. You look at the personnel cost, and how I have arranged the data is it's a percentage of the revenues that the organization has. If you look at the personnel cost as a percentage of revenue in a typical manufacturing organization, it would tend to be in the nature of around 8 to 11%. If we look at the hospital sector, it would tend to be in the range of 17 to 22%. Why? Because we know that hospitals are slightly more manpower intensive than manufacturing organizations. Manufacturing industries are very capex oriented, very capex driven. And that's one of the reasons as to why you see depreciation in the first table as a number of 5, as against depreciation and amortization in the third table, which is just 2.3. IT services organizations have a lower amount of capex that can depreciate, right? The computers and the laptops and stuff that we use are not of too much value, unlike a 3 crore filler machine in a bottling plant in a manufacturing organization, or an 8 crore X-ray machine in a hospital sector. So when we look at some of these numbers, it tells you the industry's affordability to pay, because the personal cost is a significantly important line item in the P&L sheet and adds to the cost, which depletes the top line when we come down from the top to the bottom line. So the profitability of the organization and the company in that industry is significantly impacted by some of these line items, and people cost being very large, fairly large in an IT services. Now look at the difference. In a manufacturing organization, the personal cost is around 8% of the revenues. In the hospitals, it's around 17 to 22. But when it comes to IT services, it's 54%. So many of the levers that we use in terms of maintaining organizational profitability has to do, unfortunately, with the personnel cost, because it forms a very large line item in between the top line and the bottom line. Now, let me go to the next slide. All right, but I'm very sure you will have a lot of questions out here. Maybe I can take it later, but let me move to the next slide. Remember this slide? We talked about the total points, how the total points are falling into a particular point range, and therefore how we determine the position. Once the position is determined, we know where the position stands in terms of the organization's pyramid. Now, going back to that, let's say when we have, let's say the 56 was our position number, and it could be somewhere in the range of deputy general manager, general manager. We typically then take a market and industry report. Now, this survey is happening across hundreds of companies. And these hundreds of companies belong to not just our industry that we are interested in, it may belong to other industries as well. So when we ask for a job report, we have to make sure that we are getting something which is specific to our industry and measures us with who our competitors are. I cannot compete and therefore cannot compare myself with an IT product company because I'm not in the IT product space. I'm in the IT services space. Similarly, I cannot compare myself with a hospital space because of the large differences that you saw in the last slide. So therefore, when this data is taken from, and we don't typically prepare the data, we buy it from the market, but it's important to understand when the report comes in, what does it mean? It typically means that an IT services organization or whatever organization that I am in, sorry, I shouldn't have given that example, whatever organization that I am in, assuming that I have got the data corresponding to that industry, and I have benchmarked, customized benchmarked against my competitors in the same space, a typical 50 to 60 position holder would tend to be in the range of a particular median and a percentile. Right now, we don't need to know what those numbers are, and that's the reason you see it kind of grayed out, because that is not the subject of the discussion out here, because I am assuming that you would possibly know what medians are, what benchmarks are. Medians are nothing but what statistically is referred to as P50. We kind of take survey inputs of how general managers across companies in the same industry, in the same space are paid. And then we take the median value, not the mean value, but the median value. There's a lot of difference between median and mean statistically, particularly when it comes to compensation. It can completely shoot you off your chair if we don't understand the difference. So we typically take the median value, which is what we call the percentile 50. It's nothing, it's nothing complicated. Fundamentally, statistically, it means that if you have 100 general manager salaries from the industry and the companies that you have benchmarked against, and I arrange them in ascending order, the midpoint is called P50. The 25th point is called 25th percentile. The 75th point is called the 75th percentile. And therefore, there would be a lot of general managers who would be paid in that range of array. Let's say 100 general managers. I would have to decide where I have to place my general manager as far as the compensation is concerned. And well, that is true for any software engineer or senior software engineer and so on and so forth. So this benchmark of the median and the organization's median, etc., etc. Now I compare the organization's median to the market median to say this is where I am. That score, right? And so that we know how far are we behind the industry and what do we need to do. And sometimes it cannot be done overnight, but having the awareness that we should do something about it helps us do better budgeting for the next year. So some of these things are very, very important compensation parameters from a pure data perspective. All right. Now, once we are in the organization, right, and on the career ladder, there are many other internal factors that I talked about: individual performance and potential, organization's internal directions on maintaining profitability, etc., etc., the experience and the specific expertise that one brings to the table, and so on and so forth. So this means, going back to my point, that you need to be in the right place at the right time. It also means additionally that we also have to strive continuously to up our game on being in the right role, keep the performance, build potential continuously, reskill continuously, and build perspectives as we gain experience to be able to claim that compensation, right? Because 10 years in an organization does not necessarily mean anything unless I have built perspectives. And once I have built that, once I have built expertise and experience, both, my compensation builds up accordingly. All right. Fantastic. So let me, Shweta, you want me to break for a little while? It's 4:52 now.
Yes, yes. So there is a question, and it's very
Sure.
relevant to what you've been discussing right now. We have Juheen Dotto, and she is asking, Juheen is asking us, what are the steps to be followed and key parameters to be considered to perform compensation benchmarking exercise for various job positions in a company? I think you have already highlighted the factors at large. Would you
Yes.
like to highlight a bit more and give some more parameters or indications as to how to carry it out?
Sure. Sure. So I think I see a very similar question in the chat screen from Shirupa also. I think kind of similar.
Mhm.
But fundamentally what we do is, I mean, we know what our organization's medians are. So for example, we have, let's say, production engineers. We have procurement managers. We have factory heads. In another industry, it could be software engineers, senior software engineers, etc., etc. In a hospital sector, it could be not just nurses, but ICU nurses, LCU nurses, general ward nurses, depending on different skill sets. Now we do know what their compensation is. I mean, unless it's a startup sector, right? If it's a startup, it's a different ball game altogether. We have to go from scratch one, right? In terms of, how much can I afford to pay if I am doing staffing services? My next slide actually talks about that, but let me not jump the gun. But fundamentally, if I have the data, assuming that I'm a steady state organization, I need to do a benchmarking to correct my salaries. I would put them in an Excel sheet, all the salaries of all the roles. I would go to a typical consultant partner. I wouldn't want to do it myself because it's a very complicated exercise and we are not specialists in the field to do that. And most importantly, if I do that, there would be biases that would creep in. And therefore, it is better to take a neutral expertise from an external consultant, which we have in the form of, let's say, a Hay Conferry, an Aon Hewitt, a Mercer. There are loads of them in the market today, but these are the top three that I can recall right now. And we take from them that what would be Mr. Consultant or Miss Consultant, can you please tell me what my procurement manager should be paid? Now, the moment I ask the question, the consultant is going to ask me the question that, what is your organization size? What is the economic value chain activities that are going on in your organization? And will come back in a week to tell you that a procurement manager at your place would be in the range of X to Y. And that X to Y is basically constituted of the salary ranges of multiple procurement managers who are in the same space as yours. And then you will say, okay, fine, my procurement manager, where does he or she fall in that entire range? And therefore, I would do a correction, if not overnight, but at least I'm aware of where the person is and take a call on that. And that would also tell me that if the procurement manager is significantly overpaid, rather than think about, getting this guy out, can this person be given certain other responsibilities, higher responsibilities in addition to procurement, right? Maybe ESG, right? Or maybe something else. I don't know. I mean, that's the first thing that came to my mind. Can I take an ESG responsibility along with procurement responsibility to be able to justify that compensation, and so on and so forth? So I know it's a little bit of a deep discussion, but you can reach out to me separately, and maybe I can go into a little bit of more detail on that. All right. Shweta, can we move on to the next one? I think that's the last. Sure. All right. So let me move on to the next one. This is more of a process slide. See, compensation, and I think we make a lot of mistakes in compensation. In my, again, 23 years of limited experience in HR, I have always seen compensation, regardless of what kind of survey we do, what time the survey was rolled out, to whom it was rolled out, across industries. And I've worked in multiple industries, not just companies. I have seen compensation is always one of the bottommost point. When you survey somebody on a compensation, and you all know that it is impossible, it is literally impossible to move the needle, to move it from our negative, mostly negative, sometimes neutral perspective to a positive perception as far as the survey is concerned. Now, a part of that is perception itself, as in, I will never be happy with my compensation. Regardless of compensation is such a matter that I can never be happy with it. So I think a part of that neutral / negative perception around compensation about what my employer is paying to me comes from there. But I think the bigger thing that happens is from an organizational standpoint, and I will have to stand corrected first on that, as an employer representative, not just an employee representative, because I'm switching between two hats right now as I'm speaking. I think a lot has to do with our not understanding the process of compensation. Now, if we go into something called people capability maturity model, it's one of the oldest and one of the best models and framework that I've come across, which spans across the entire employee life cycle stage of events. Now, according to the people capability maturity model, and you can search up on Google, there's a free version 2 that they have released. Carnegie Mellon University has released a few years back. Compensation comes as part of managed state of the organization, right? In the initial stage, the organization is defined as one that doesn't have anything. Complete ad hoc decisions. The owner says, you give a salary increment to this person, you hire 50 people, You fire 25 the next day. Those are typical ad hoc processes. When the organization reaches a managed state and then defined and then predictable and then optimized, compensation is at the managed stage itself. Now, that fundamentally means that even before we can talk about things like mentoring and organizational capability development and competencies, we have to talk about compensation and make sure that it is right. We have to talk about training and development and make sure that is right. We have to talk about performance management at a very basic level and make sure that is right, because those are managed services, not managed services, but at the managed level, at level 2, right? So we cannot have any mistakes done there. And once we don't do that, and once we don't understand the model and the process that goes into it, that is where the dissatisfaction increases going forward. Because I am talking about mentoring and participatory culture and career development without setting the first thing right. Now, if you look at how Carnegie Mellon talks about PCMM, each of these have goals, commitments, abilities, practices, measurements, and analysis. Right. Compensation as an area has 4 goals. And what are these goals? I have just given one example for you to understand what a goal means, and there would be 4 goals, and the statements of them are quite elaborate. But one of the goals is that compensation is equitable relative to skill, qualifications, and performance. Now, if I start compensating at random levels, not following this particular goal, my process and philosophy is wrong. Second, compensation has 2 commitments. For example, one of the commitments says that the organization must establish and maintain a documented policy for conducting its compensation activities. Today, I'm giving 50 people a sudden compensation increment because the owner or the promoter or the CEO wanted me to do it. Do I have it documented as being done? Am I doing it? Or if I am being able to compel it, is it being audited and put in as part of a standard process? Is what that commitment asks us to emphasize on. It talks about 3 abilities, right? It talks about individuals perform. Now, one of the abilities is that the individuals performing compensation activities receive the preparation needed to perform their responsibilities. Suddenly, I decide that I like my supply chain guy, but he's overcompensated. I don't know what to do with that guy. Let me call him to corporate and ask him to take over compensation. Does that work? It goes against the person's ability to perform compensation activities because the person is not even trained. Now that violates the ability level when we are operating at managed level 2 of PCMM. Similarly, there are 11 practices. One of the practices is action has to be taken to correct inequities in compensation or other deviations from the organization's policy, strategy, and plan. If I know that my diversity population is affected and there is a conscious or unconscious bias, right, which places them at a compensation lower than their male counterparts for the same job that they are doing, the practice is not being followed in compensation because I am not taking the action to correct the inequities in compensation. So my practice has gone wrong there, and 11 such practices are there, very detailed practices. So please do have it has been my Bible and red book since the time I have got into HR, the people capability maturity model. Please take the opportunity to go and learn it. It's not just for the compensation standpoint. It talks about the entire employee life cycle events. All right. So now I will stop by at this point in time. I think I will take questions if there are any. I think that will be slightly more interactive rather than maintaining a monologue. Will that be okay?
Yes, Shubhro, that'll be okay. However, there are no further questions that I see.
Sure.
Please elaborate on job dimension 2, important act, and next one, innovation, is from Rajat De. That's the last question of the evening. So probably he's asking you on page 5.
Yeah, maybe this one.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So thank you. So who were the questions from? Sorry, Shweta?
Rajat De.
Oh, hi, Rajat. Hi. Rajat, we can touch base again separately on this, but fundamentally innovation also has specific stages. right? So, for example, the topmost possibly would be a breakthrough innovation, which not only impacts my role or my organization, but the work that I'm doing is possibly likely to disrupt the entire ecosystem. So, for example, if the role holder or the role requires researching on the latest uh, optimization techniques for a supply chain, that would possibly be a breakthrough uh, assessment in the model that we are talking about, versus uh, a procurement manager who is basically doing engineering stores uh, and also doing um, the general transportation negotiations, etc., sitting in a factory. That would typically be somewhere between a delivery stage or maybe a tactical stage, but definitely not a strategic one. So innovation can have multiple aspects that we are talking about. Uh, I mean, uh, whether now an Intel manager in the R&D center would possibly be paid more than somebody else who's doing in another company who's doing a breakthrough job because of the AI impact and stuff that is happening. Uh, Obviously, the thing will change because well, there's a subjective element as well. I mean, sometimes organizations try to hike up their status on compensation by giving wrong descriptors, the descriptor that you see out there. But it is for the consultant and the neutral person and the HR person of the organization to sit and challenge that to business, saying that, boss, you are saying that your procurement manager needs to be paid this much because he or she is doing the highest level of innovation possible. Please explain whether it is breakthrough or it is delivery, or it is tactical, or it is plain operation. Now, those are the kind of questions that we kind of tend to ask before we decide on the scores of the innovation, let's say, with respect to a supply chain job. I don't know whether I've been able to explain this, but I can possibly explain this with more data when if you want, you can send an email and maybe I'll try to respond to that.
We'll definitely do that. And this is for everyone. We can ask him questions through email. You can all write to our common ID, and we can collate all the questions and send it to Suvro for him to give us personalized responses basis the specific queries that we may have.
Sure.
So I don't see any more questions as of now, Shubro, which brings me to the thought that this is just a well-defined starting point to the entire employee lifecycle management. Getting this right is crucial and fundamental to have engaged employees across the value chain in a way that we bring in the diverse population, work around them through the different stages. And as you rightly said, having the fundamental of HR in place in terms of building the culture, training and development, performance management, all of that together. And then these science then fits in to create a completely transparent approach to giving performance and potential based experience to our employees. Thank you so much for today. I would really want you to say and conclude the masterclass with your final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Shweta, and it's been a pleasure, as I said, and it's always a pleasure doing something for NHRDN Kolkata, not because I belong to that place. That would be a biased statement to make, but because knowledge is all pervasive, and we keep sharing, and we keep dialoguing, and we keep conversing. So I'll be glad to be of any help to the chapter and to the function. I have uh, years back, I was at a decision point in terms of what career to choose and stuff like that. And trust me, in my 23 years, I have not regretted being in the HR function, because I think, regardless of what my marketeers and finance and supply chain guys would say, I may sound wacky on this, but I think the biggest of the big data is here. And if there is anything that needs to be researched on, that needs to be dialogued on, that needs to be conversed on, it is only the human resource field, and possibly, I mean, it far surpasses the opportunity to innovate, the opportunity to contribute, and the opportunity to scale up. So glad to be part of the HR function, and looking forward to additional contributions as and when. Thank you, Sweata, and thank you very much for arranging this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Suvro. You kind of gave us the affirmation that we are indeed in the business of people. And there could be nothing more noble and more contributing to the entire community of professionals than contributing to people and their progression at large. Thank you, Shubhro. Have a great evening and a great weekend ahead. Everyone, take care, stay safe. See you in the next episode of HR Speaks very soon. Happy monsoon to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.